You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week, we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week, we're joined by Dr. Lauren Kenworthy, a leading expert in the field of autism and executive functioning. Dr. Kenworthy is the author of Unstuck and On Target, a school-based intervention program proven to help children on the autism spectrum develop critical executive functioning skills. Today, we'll be discussing how executive functioning impacts learning and daily life for autistic individuals, as well as practical strategies to support these skills at home, in school, and beyond. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Lauren Kenworthy.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Well, we appreciate you coming on. And one thing I'd love for our guests to be able to do is to explore what drove you to this passion. Is that when we're talking about service and autism in general, it's oftentimes we have something that says, I was drawn to this. So what brought you into the field of autism?
So I am trained as a pediatric neuropsychologist. So that means I'm trained to work with kids and their families to kind of understand what their pattern of learning and thinking strengths and weaknesses are. And I was trained very broadly. So I was working with kids who had like medical conditions like epilepsy or brain tumors, and kids who had learning conditions like, learning disabilities or ADHD. And I was seeing all kinds of kids when I first came out of fellowship and really enjoying the work. But there was this one group of kids that was really both fascinating and troubling to me because they were coming in, and so often folks in their community, teachers and parents and the kids themselves, were really struggling with this idea that they were just not behaving right, not doing the right thing, not trying, being stubborn, not caring. And it didn't ring true to me, But when I study them, when I do these assessments and try to understand how their brains were working and how they were processing information, what I'd see is they had all kinds of strengths. Some of these kiddos had really big vocabularies, and some of these kiddos had incredible memories. But as I was working with them, I was also realizing they had big challenges with understanding social perspectives and with executive function. And so a lot of times as we uncovered that, we could work on an autism diagnosis. And I realized that this is a group of kids who has an unusual pattern of things they're really good at and then things that are really hard, and that's confusing to people. And it was exciting to me to try to figure out if I could help us all understand them better.
Absolutely. And I mean, I love the fact that as a pediatric neuropsychologist that you're looking at those strengths, you're trying to be able to identify those, because in the clinical world, it kind of starts with you, and you're the one that should be feeding so much information to any other clinician that's a part of that child's care model. And one thing that I think, whether it's practitioner or family, the understanding of executive functioning, I don't know that everybody fully grasps the impact and the importance of this in helping somebody to develop skills and feel empowered. So maybe you can give us a little bit of an example of what is executive functioning or why it's important specifically for autistic individuals.
Absolutely. And I think, a lot of us struggle to grasp what executive functionings are. Like if we say, well, there's a part of the brain that works on language, we all have an idea of what talking and listening and stuff is about, or visual processing, but executive functions, like what? So it's definitely something to pause and think about. And one of the first things to know about executive functioning is that it's very much brain-based. Just like learning your words or remembering, the facts that you hear in school, executive functioning lives in the brain. It lives in the prefrontal subcortical circuitry of our brains, and it is what helps us to efficiently carry out goal-directed behavior, which is a big mouthful. But basically, some people think about it like the conductor of the brain or the CEO of the brain, because it's the part of our brain that helps us to know, okay, right now I need to be listening, or right now I have this great solution, but it's not actually for the problem that I'm addressing. So I need to be flexible and switch gears. And it's something that we all do all the time, but we're not as aware of it as some of the other brain functions.
Absolutely. And I mean, is it safe to say that we all have different learning styles? And when you're talking on the autism spectrum, is that it's even more important to realize how somebody's processing information and how best to be able to utilize their strengths in the way that they are understanding the world around them?
Absolutely. That's what's exciting to me about the work that I do is that moment when you can kind of, with these very specific tasks that we have, look into somebody's processing and then share that with them and other people. And there's often a moment of recognition where parents see, oh, wow, he's really seeing that visual that I'm asking him to copy differently than I am. And that starts to help people understand where the strengths are as well as where the challenges are. But until you understand that, you're just kind of a little bit in the dark where you figure he's seeing it just like I am, but then why is he acting the way he is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things that that helps, at least for me, to be able to better understand the concept is giving a real life example. And maybe we could put it into context of a child meeting somebody for the first time and trying to be able to initiate some form of connection. How would I notice maybe some different executive functioning leading to different responses to that sort of scenario?
Yes, I will definitely answer that question. But first, I'm just going to back up a little bit and say one of the first things for understanding what executive functioning looks like is to realize that we all have bad executive functioning days. And so, because it's a distributed network in our brain, it's actually more vulnerable than other ones. So, if you don't sleep that well the night before, if you're really worried about a sick relative or you didn't eat your breakfast, you are likely to struggle with your executive functions. So, you don't even have to go to your kiddo. You can just think about the last time, you got up on the wrong side of bed and were running late to work and spilled your coffee on yourself in the car, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can feel some of your executive functions break down at that point.
Yeah.
Maybe you have a little more trouble inhibiting your impulses. Maybe that's when you kind of swear or say things you don't want to the person in the car with you. Maybe you get a little stuck, like all you can think about is, I just spilled the damn coffee,
Yeah.
and you can't move on to the solution. Those are kinds of examples of ways that we all can feel some of our executive functions break down. But I think your example is a really key one because there's a huge intersection between the demands for social thinking and executive functioning on kids when they meet other kids. And sometimes as grown-ups, we forget about this because adults are much less demanding of
Mm-hmm.
somebody to kind of meet them on their own terms, right? You know, I see you at a cocktail party. I walk up, I wait until you're done talking. I ask you a question, I pause. Kids, they interact in a much more organic kind of way, and it's very demanding on executive functions.
Mm-hmm.
So, a kid walks onto a playground, and the first thing they have to do from an executive function perspective is see a big picture of who's there, right?
Yeah.
And who's doing the things that I like to do? And what do I know about these people? Like, did I meet them before? Is that the playground bully over there? Or is that the kid that actually I had a great time with last time? So they have to integrate a lot of what they've learned beforehand. And while they might be trying to do that in the nanosecond that they arrive on the playground, some other kid might run up to them and say, hey, tag, you're it, run off.
Mm-hmm.
And then they have to integrate that. And do I want to play tag? And what are the rules? And how do I respond? And then maybe they don't know, did that kid hit me in a friendly way? Like, I want you to join me? Or did that kid hit me in a sort of more aggressive way? And could I pick up anything on their facial expression or body language? There's a big demand to process and integrate a lot of information. And while you're doing that, you have to regulate your own thinking, your
Yeah.
own feelings. and your own behaviors. And those are all executive skills, those regulatory skills. So there's a lot on that kiddo at that moment. And I think it's one of the most demanding things we ask kids to do from an executive function perspective.
It's demanding, but it's vital. So when you're talking through all those situations, it's one of those components that if you're not developing those skills over time, that is going to create some major barriers throughout life. And I guess that I'll go back to the fact that you are one of the first touch points. A psychologist, and especially a pediatric neuropsychologist, is one that can inform so much on this particular skill set and just the child's way of engaging the environment and understanding and processing. So when you're looking at these things, are you looking at it through like a developmental lens? Are you looking to say, hey, not only should I be seeing these skills develop, but this is the timeline that I would expect some of these things to occur?
Yeah, that's a great question because yes, and yes, right? So I absolutely have a developmental timeline for when I expect things to occur. I also know that these executive function skills, as well as social referencing skills, these are actually core to development. So for the really little kid, let's take that little, 1 year old who's just starting to develop language, just starting to develop a little bit of executive function. They have certain jobs in the world, and one of them is to learn from the people around them about what's important in the world, right? And so there's this really basic thing we do with little kids, which is like, hey, look, there's an airplane, right? And we want the kiddo to look up at the airplane and then to look back at us, because that's actually how they find out it's fun to look at airplanes, right? If you don't share that experience with somebody else, then what does that mean?
Yeah.
And so part of that is really executive. I have to look away from what already was interesting me, right? I have to respond to you, then I have to follow your point, then I have to come back and check back in with you from that airplane, right? That's a lot of steps. And so one of the things that's really important to me about understanding executive function early is we need to build those flexibility skills, those big picture thinking skills, that behavior regulation, so that kids can learn from the people that they love and know around them.
Absolutely.
But then I think your other question though is about like, so what happens over time for the individual in terms of their executive functions? And the story there is that we keep increasing the expectations and demands for executive functioning, right? So you get to preschool and the big demand is, can you sit in circle time, right? People end up at my office if they can't sit in circle time, right? That's inhibiting a lot of your physical behavior, right? That's an executive function skill, not interrupting, not pushing, those kind of things. And that's a first level executive demand. And we do expect to see that in toddlers. But then once they get to elementary school, especially first and second grade, now you got to regulate your attention, right? You got to sit in class. Maybe you're at a desk. The teacher's going to talk. You've got to process what she's saying, hold it in working memory, which is another executive function skill where you keep track of what people are saying to guide your behavior. And then do something with it. Like she just told me how to fill out this worksheet. Now I got to color all the squares green or whatever the instruction was. And then when you hit secondary school, there's this huge, bigger demand around managing multiple people in terms of going across teachers, more complex social situations, and then the tasks get bigger too.
Yeah, I mean, you have that foundation that I think that you were talking about, that, this core set of skills. And it really sounds like without that core set, you don't have the opportunity to be able to build upon it and create that pyramid of success. But you've created intervention programs and you've looked at, how do I set somebody up for success with executive functioning? Do you mind giving us a little bit of, I guess, a little snapshot of what your intervention program looks like and how you approach some of these skills?
Yeah, I love talking about Unstuck and on Target. So first of all, it's not just me. One of the reasons I think Unstuck is a good a good program is because we developed it in a group, and we had people from different disciplines, an occupational therapist, educators, psychology. But it came to me as something that we should do because I kept seeing kids struggling with these executive function skills and talking to parents about it. And there really weren't interventions out there to support them. So there was more going on around social skills, and there was more going on around, being able to, do some basic linguistic and communication skills. But this part felt like it wasn't getting addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by this part is that if you have autism, you're much, much more likely to be less flexible in your thinking. And you're much more likely to be more detail focused and have more trouble kind of seeing the big picture. And that can mean knowing what all's going on that playground. It can also mean knowing what your goal is. Like, why am I here? What am I doing? What's the purpose of this? So those were, and then making a plan to reach that goal. So those were the areas of executive functioning that we wanted to target.
Yeah. When you're talking about some of those things that you kind of looked at as barriers, are those potentially strengths to be able to build off of as well in your program?
Oh, what a great question. Yes, yes. So our first mission in Unstuck is we have to start with understanding. And there's two pieces to that. One is we're not going to just judge a behavior based on a behavior, right? So we talk about questioning whether a quote unquote won't could actually be a can't yet, right? Something that I'm looking at as a teacher or a parent or the kid myself and saying, that's a stubborn, you're lazy, you don't really care about doing well. Could that be that you have a flexibility challenge? Could that be that you have a challenge with kind of knowing where to start or initiating, as you said earlier? So that's one piece of the understanding. But the other piece of the understanding that you're bringing up that I think is fundamental is, what are the strengths that come with that? Because if any really successful intervention is going to build on the strengths, right? And so the inflexible brain has what we call inflexibility strengths, right? We see kids who can do these deep dives into different areas of knowledge. Whatever it is that fascinates them, they're able to focus on that and be inflexible in their dedication to knowing everything there is about that. We see a lot of loyalty. We see a lot of ability to follow a rule once you understand it. We see a lot of strength in kind of persistence and commitment. So right now, I think about that in terms of commitment to social justice, knowing what's right and standing by that and not being influenced because, other people are saying confusing things about that. Like you know what it is and you stick by it. So those are key inflexibility strengths. The detail processors, those are the people that I want calibrating my medicine, they're focusing on the specific details and they're not going to let those go. So they're an essential component. And a lot of times that builds in with computer-based strengths. It can build in with engineering-related strengths because you need to know the details, right? I don't want somebody building the building that doesn't know exactly what the formula is for the cement and isn't going to be really precise about that. So celebrating those strengths is something that we think is really important for getting off first base in terms of where you go next.
And so, with these processing styles and processing strengths, I would imagine that's one of those components that you're assessing right off the bat, whether you're coaching a school, coaching a family on how to be able to truly empower their child. Is that the first step is assessing, really understanding, and then tailoring any sort of intervention to what you've learned from that and those core, I guess, foundational skills that you can actually work with?
Yeah. One of where we start from is building curiosity, right? Because that's where I think there's power in intervening with kids is when you have a behavior that you think isn't really serving that kid well, the first thing is to be curious about where's that coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And again, we don't want to make a negative attribution when that's not what's actually driving it, because it totally limits our opportunities for intervention.
Yeah.
Right? Right? If you're really not trying, all I can do is keep you in from recess, right? And we're going to get stuck. We're both going to get inflexible, and we're going to get stuck in a control battle that isn't going to be helpful. So absolutely, we start by sort of thinking, what do we know about this kiddo? How can what we know help us help them to sort of make the changes in their life that they want to make? But the other thing that I think is really important and is essential, I think, for the equity issue that you mentioned when you opened up this conversation is, what are the ways that the environment that this kiddo is in are not a good fit for their brain? You know, if a kid is in a wheelchair, nobody in any school or family thinks that they're going to ask them to crawl up the steps, right? The wheelchair ramps are kind of a given. But when you have executive function challenges, when your brain has trouble being flexible, there's some basic structures you can put in place that are really make a standard school setting much more accessible. A predictable routine, giving a 5-minute warning. This is not rocket science. This is things a lot of people know, but they don't always put it all together, especially for a kid who's very verbal. Or, you know, I've seen kids that come in and they're, one of the early kids that I worked with was kind of on his teacher's very last nerve, right? Because he, quote, would not write.
Yeah.
And he had a superior intelligence. This kiddo was very, very bright. And he knew a lot about everything, and he talked a lot about everything. But she saw him as refusing to write. And when we looked at his executive functions and saw that actually that step of integrating the big picture was super hard for him. So he had all of these ideas, but to pull them together into one step was really hard for him.
Yeah.
Then we were able to talk about some basic supports, like a structured a routine that he could do, a kind of a recipe to go from brainstorming to an outline. We could also see that his fine motor control was poor, so we could provide a support that was getting him on a computer. And when we could put those supports in place and help the teacher be curious about why he wasn't writing, then the whole situation turned around very dramatically, and we hadn't taught him any new skills at that point.
Yeah, and that invisible barrier piece that you're talking about, I hear families talk about that so frequently, and they have to be able to advocate for that, is that you have to have a forum to be able to do this. And when you're talking about the schools, you have the opportunity with an individualized education plan or a 504 accommodation. Is that the venue that the school, the teacher, the family can really be taking a step back and looking at some of these core issues instead of trying to be able to create kind of bland goals, or trying to be able to say, this is my expectation, versus looking at, this is how I'm going to address these things, knowing this child well. Is that the forum for it?
That's a great forum.
And when they're going through that process, should an IEP bring in a psychologist? Should they be bringing in more reports to be able to help guide the teacher, to guide the school, to guide everybody to really understand that processing and how executive functioning has been working for that child?
Yeah, I think that can work as a really good way to do that. Absolutely. I personally love to have the 504 or the IEP process as a moment where we all get together and get curious about who this kiddo is, where their strengths are, as well as their challenges, and what kind of supports we could put in place to help them thrive at school. And sometimes it's more that process than the actual document, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's a moment where I can just ask some questions, like, you're saying something and it really sounds to me like you think of this Johnny as somebody who can't do this versus you're saying something and you really think of him as somebody who's refusing to do this. Is that what you mean? And often just starting that conversation in that way helps people to kind of see how they may be a little bit stuck in one view of a kiddo and not recognizing all the ways that the setting is just a bad fit for this particular child's collection of strengths and weaknesses.
Absolutely. And setting environment plays such a crucial role as a teacher, is that a teacher is being asked to be able to individualize for 25, 30 kids at a time sometimes. And that's got to be really difficult. So what advice do you give to a teacher who's trying to support so many children who process differently, who you need to be able to accommodate for differently in a group environment?
Boy, that's such a key point. And I get so worried about what we put on that mainstream classroom teacher. And sometimes I'll see IEPs or 504s or just people's expectations that are a mile long, right? And it's like, how is this poor person supposed to do all these things? It's hard. And sometimes it's really about just pushing hard for, no, this kiddo deserves some individualized attention, and the teacher can't do that. And so we want an IEP, not a 504 at that moment, and we want some specialized work. But one of the things that we do a lot with Unstuck is we try to think about how do we just build a common language that is going to support a child and a teacher and a parent sort of throughout that kiddo's day. And that common language is built on understanding, and it's built on kind of recognizing that we all use supports all the time. I've got eyeglasses on now, right? You take those away, and it's going to be a lot more difficult for me to carry out this podcast, right? It's just a basic support, and kids can need those as well, and they can be things that are pretty simple for a classroom teacher to put in place. But the other piece is this common language of flexibility, of big picture thinking that teachers can use as they go through their day, right? So the teachers, trying to do a lesson on that Promethean board that they have at the front of the class, and the Promethean board shuts down. And that's a great opportunity for her to say, oh man, this isn't what I expected. I'm stuck. I'm really frustrated now because I wanted to show you this cool thing and now I can't. I need a plan B. Can anybody help me think of a plan B? So those are kind of common unstuck vocabulary words. They're really simple, right? Plan A, plan B, stuck, big deal, little deal. They're not complex, but we can all model them all the time for kids. And that in itself is a very powerful intervention.
Yeah, and I mean, just even having that starting point to be able to build the concept of support a little bit differently. And I think that your intervention strategy with the unstuck principles allows for a reconceptualization of things in a way that's going to be so supportive for children. But this is it's a lifelong challenge. We are still looking at executive functioning and building on those skills as we go through life. It doesn't stop. So as somebody leaves those support networks where maybe they have the school, maybe they have additional supports through clinical services, what do you recommend for autistic adults that are still looking to strengthen some of these executive functioning skills?
Oh, that's such a great question. And there's so much in that question, because the first thing is just to remind people executive functions have the most protracted development of some of the major brain functions. So I really know a lot about what your language is going to look like by the time you're 5. But executive functions develop over the first 2.5 decades of life. There's no hope for me. I'm on the downward spiral. But for a lot of folks entering adulthood, they're still developing. They're still myelinating those systems. So there's still a lot of organic growth that we can build on with intervention and work. And that's the first message, is like, you are in the process of developing your executive functions through into your 20s. So take advantage of that and build in new skills, knowing that you're going to get an extra oomph from what your biological development is doing. But then the other part of your question is, wow, is it hard when you have executive function challenges to make that transition from school? Because even as much as we can say, oh, the schools aren't doing enough, and the IEPs aren't covering enough of what's needed, or the 504s, the fact of the matter is when you leave secondary school, you leave that world altogether, and now you have to advocate for every support that you need. And so
Mm-hmm.
what we've done with Unstuck is it's a spiraling curriculum. So we have it for elementary school age kids, for middle school age kids, and then for high school into young adulthood. And as kids get older, we shift the emphasis a little bit from the onus being on the adults in the world of the child's world to help them recognize where the fits aren't so good between their brain and the environment, and to advocate for supports that they may need. And we really push into strong self-understanding of what your strengths are, what your challenges are, and recognition that when you're less common, and that's all you are when you're neurodivergent, right? It's not that you're better or worse. Your brain is a little less common. And just like a person who's taller than most people,
Yeah.
you're going to find that the settings that you go into aren't necessarily set to fit you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I have a son who's 6'4", and he struggles to find a car that fits him, right? You have a person who's less flexible in their thinking, and they will struggle to find settings that fit them. And then they need to know how to advocate. And so we do a lot of work on really simple routines for advocating, kind of almost scripted routines. My goal is X. I'm struggling with Y. Can you help me with Z? Or my goal is X. I'm really good at Y. Can you allow me to go in this direction with Z? And so to really push into that part of the process.
Yeah, and I would imagine that just having that language, having that ability to self-advocate opens up doors within the professional world, within relationships that maybe otherwise could have been closed because the world around us, it reacts, and it doesn't always react in a patient way. It doesn't always react in an empathetic way. So it's trying to figure out how to navigate that, which is a challenge. Um, would you say that it's still very important for young adults all the way through, I guess, adolescence through young adulthood, that they still find that safe place? I imagine schools being that safe place where I can try my new skill sets. I can try to be able to put myself in positions. Maybe I'm vulnerable. Is that still important through that maturation process?
Absolutely. And we all need that, right? We all need our safe place and our safe person. And, that's one thing that I really encourage neurodivergent people to think hard about, because especially because they're navigating this other world so much of the time, they need to know who their people are. They need to seek those people out and make sure that they have places where they get to really be themselves, and that they then can make decisions about going into other parts of the world, right? Well,
Hmm.
on the job, I'm going to, kind of work on this set of skills, and I'm going to be actively advocating and educating people about what my needs are. But the safe person idea is so strong. There's this wonderful um, clip that I can share with you, but it's about a guy who's autistic who goes through just a hell in an airport and ends up with multiple delays and actually having a meltdown. And that's one of the things that we really build around understanding when we talk about that, is this risk of overload. If you have a little bit less flexible brain, if you're focused on details, you are more easily overloaded and overwhelmed. And we want to avoid that. And sometimes we can't. And for
Hmm.
this guy, he's in the airport, and his safe person turned out to be one of the airport staff who recognized that he was struggling and understood his behavior as expressive of overload, and not that he was, some sort of strange person with bizarre behavior, and really stepped in to help him navigate getting a plane after multiple delays. And it's just a wonderful story. It's from that StoryCorps collection where two people go into a booth, and record
Hmm.
an important experience. And it's a lovely, lovely story.
Yeah. And I mean, when we talk about everything that is occurring within the world of executive functioning, one of the pieces that I find encouraging is that outside of the pediatric neurology or neuropsychology space, other clinical paradigms are starting to put the focus on that earlier in the lifespan and then adapting and modifying and changing it as somebody develops skills or is changing different components of their life. What would you see, or I guess, what excites you right now about the future of research or the future of implementing research that you're seeing in the process and that you're seeing starting to develop?
Well, I mean, one of the things that's exciting to me is I started thinking about executive functions and autism, like I said, because I had clients who taught me to think about that, to showed me that I needed to be curious about that. And, 20 years ago, there was very little discussion in research forums about executive function or in clinical forums. I remember being at the International Meeting for Autism Research and putting up, a presentation about executive function and autism, and somebody saying, "Why are you studying that?" It was just like, it wasn't like there was a lot of interest. So the fact that people are focusing on this now, I think, is really exciting. The other thing that I think is really exciting for me personally in the research world is this growth of work that we get to do in the community through even co-production methods where we're directly engaging neurodivergent folks as we're trying to figure out how to make these interventions better. So for
Mhm.
Unstuck, we got to work with autistic self-advocates at each stage to kind of make sure that how we were thinking about the intervention was how we really should think about it. And we learned such interesting things there. I'll never forget Ari Naiman, who used to run the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. When we first showed him Unstuck, we were so proud. We're like, look, we're showing people, it's working. People can become more flexible. And he was very, socially appropriate. He did the right thing. He complimented our work. He said, but there's one thing you're forgetting. And we said, what? And he said, sometimes we need to be inflexible. He said, if we are at risk for getting overwhelmed and overloaded, and if we are entering environments that can be hostile to us, as they can be, a standard lunchroom has a bunch of people who are struggling much more to know what's the socially right thing to do than the autistic kiddo who's entering it, right? They can be bullied, they can be teased, they can be mistreated. He said, given that that's our environment, sometimes we need to be inflexible and stick to a routine that we know is safe.
Mhm.
And that was a really powerful insight and important for us as we were thinking about how to build an intervention that fully recognizes what the strengths as well as the challenges are for folks on the autism spectrum.
Community involvement in research and in decision making is so important. And I mean, that just highlights one of those just critical impacts is that it changes the question sometimes. Where can folks go and find Unstuck and On Target or find other resources that can help them to really understand and advocate access to executive functioning interventions?
So we've put together a website that's called Unstuck and On Target, all one word, Unstuck and On Target, no capitals, just that, .com. And there we've put as many free resources as we can. So we've been lucky, PCORI's funded us, and we've done some things like we've got free videos for parents. They're in English and Spanish. They're like 3 to 5 minutes long, and they just introduce some of these executive functions. What is it? And then these quick little Unstuck principles about providing supports, avoiding overload, using this common language. And I really encourage people to start with something like that because it's free and easy and it's very brief. On that website, you also see the books that are the manuals for the elementary and middle school version. The high school version's coming out later this year, and the preschool version's on the way too. But those you have to order through Amazon or the publisher Brooks, but you can find access to them. We also have almost free teacher trainings. There's a little bit of a cost associated with getting CE credits, but they're trainings for teachers and how to do Unstuck.
Well, I appreciate all the work that you've put in around these ideas, these concepts, and the research that is emerging, and for coming on today and sharing that knowledge and sharing your experience. So we do appreciate it, Dr. Kenworthy. Thank you for coming on our show.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like autism spectrum disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.